thank you to Politics in the Pub for inviting me to speak on this important topic, and thank you all for coming on a miserable night. First, I wish to acknowledge that we stand on Aboriginal land, that of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. This land was taken by force, and until there is a just treaty with the Indigenous peoples of Australia, the place of those of us who have come subsequently cannot be seen as legitimate. The issue of just treatment of asylum seekers is close to my heart. I'm Jewish. I'm the child of refugees from the Nazis in Europe. The question of exclusion is central to the Jewish experience historically in Christian Europe. As a child, I was picked on and isolated as a child of immigrants who was different. My life of activism for social justice of all kinds is rooted in this history, both personal and world historical. I'm driven by a passion that all human beings should be included, should be valued, and should be embraced. Inclusion is a fundamental humanist and personal value for me. Thinking beyond cruelty. What a resonant title for tonight's discussion. For when we truly look at what this country is doing to people incarcerated in our detention centres, and what other word can we truthfully use? Cruelty. Let us ponder for a moment. Let us wrap it round our tongues. Let it sink into our mind what it really means. It's gratuitous, undeserved, harsh treatment. Hardly the land of the fair go. Last week, the horrors of the treatment of young Indigenous boys in a juvenile detention centre in the Northern Territory were beamed into our living rooms on national television. It's no accident that parallels were immediately drawn between Australia's policies toward asylum seekers and these young boys. The horrors of Don Dale are matched by the gulags of Manus and Nauru. On the face of it, the situations in terms of policy seem very different. But the link, in terms of the nature of the crimes, is cruelty and lawlessness, both of those. Culturally and historically and morally, these two types of cruelty are cut from the same historical cloth. Cruelty and lawlessness are built into the fabric of this country. Xenophobia and the fear of being swamped by Asians runs deep. We have not yet put the White Australia policy behind us. Our current policies toward asylum seekers and refugees are xenophobic, mean-spirited, cruel, and ludicrously expensive. Worldwide, our share of the over 60 million fleeing for safety is incredibly small, especially when compared with the burden placed on the impoverished frontline states in the Middle East. Just to remind ourselves of the cost of our current policy, in the year to June 2015, the National Commission of Audit reports that the government spent the enormous sum of $1.2 billion on detention on Manus and Nauru alone. That is $400,000 per person per year. Per person. Within Australia, such detention costs would be $139,000 per person per year. A little over half that of offshore detention, but still enormous. Whereas allowing asylum seekers to live in the community while their claims are being assessed costs $40,000 per person, and less if they work, if they have work permits. Asylum seekers on Nauru face sexual attack, humiliation, mental anguish, and denial of proper health care. The recent Amnesty and Human Rights Watch report notes that basic supplies like bandages and sterile gloves are unavailable. Dental services are limited to extractions. There is an epidemic of self-harm. In the year to July 2015, there were 188 recorded incidents of self-harm on Nauru and on Manus, and 88 on Manus. There were even more in onshore detention centres and in the community. It must not be forgotten that there are considerable pressures on people on bridging and temporary protection visas. They cannot plan their futures. They are in limbo. Commitment to long-term relationships is fraught or impossible. These current Australian policies towards the refugees and asylum seekers are the very opposite of the cosmopolitan, humanitarian and cost-effective approach we are exploring tonight. Not only are these policies xenophobic, cruel and very wasteful, they are lawless and woefully stupid. The underlying philosophy is deterrence. This says to asylum seekers that no matter what suffering they have been through or are experiencing, Australia will treat them worse, with greater cruelty, with greater lawlessness, so that they will be deterred from even attempting to come to Australia. All in the name of protecting our borders. Out of sight, out of mind. Who cares what happens to them so long as we don't see it? To even frame the issue as one of border protection is a mendacious use of language worthy of Goebbels. The word smuggler is close behind. Smuggling is an illegal activity bringing goods across national borders in defiance of the law. But there is nothing illegal about seeking asylum, so transporting asylum seekers is a perfectly legal form of service provision. The fact that a lot of the trade is brutal and exploitive is another matter. In terms of the law in relation to asylum seeking, the boot is on the other foot. Australia's detention policy is unlawful, as under our treaty obligations we are bound to consider all applications for asylum on our shores. Note that we are bound only to consider them. If claims are found to be invalid, we are not bound to admit such asylum seekers. But our legal process is in many cases severely compromised in terms of justice and integrity. Offshore detention puts asylum seekers beyond a lot of effective legal advice and support, let alone media attention. Our legislation severely curtails their rights of appeal to the courts. In their report, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch tell us, quote, "Few other countries go to such lengths to deliberately inflict suffering on people seeking safety and freedom," unquote. What a stark contrast to the leadership of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. In the face of rising tensions in response to the million refugees which Germany took in 2015, Merkel stood firm. We can do this, she asserted, with an unapologetic commitment to humanity and compassion. What a disgusting difference from our own so-called leaders who display in their race to the bottom of the xenophobic ladder. Cruelty comes from dehumanisation and indifference, demonisation of the other. And Australia's xenophobic dark angels are surely in flight as we speak. Pauline Hanson, with her opportunistic messages of hate and fear, has attracted over 580,000 voters to her cause. We must not underestimate them nor dismiss them. To challenge them effectively, we need to understand their roots. Since the 1970s, Australia has been thrall to the dogma of neoliberalism. This states that the market makes the best decisions and distributes goods and services most effectively and efficiently. Equity is not part of its lexicon except when applied to property. Neoliberalism has seen growing inequality, exclusion, misery and injustice. But the market is the political sacred cow. The atomized individual is über alles. The prize goes to the quick and nimble. The less than nimble are left behind. The people who flock to Hanson and her ilk have largely been mown down by this rampant individualism. They hang their sense of identity on a long-gone white Australia. They look for a scapegoat for their woes. The scapegoat has changed over time. Inspired by Turnbull's mantra, Pauline Hanson has been particularly nimble in picking the right one for the times. She used to focus on Asians and Indigenous Australians. Now, in the post-9/11 world, Muslims and Islam serve her purpose. The facts of the situation don't count here. In their sense of grievance, people are readily convinced of the anti-refugee narrative. Saving lives at sea, protecting our borders, protecting our way of life. They are taking our jobs, they are terrorists, queue jumpers, etc., etc. Hanson speaks to these resentments and grievances. She does it way better than the traditional class who, in their political class, who in their bubble of neoliberal dogma and haven't a clue how to connect with the rest of us. They don't care too much anyway. Part of Pauline's success is that she is not one of that class. Like her supporters, she is politically an outsider, and the refugee advocacy movement does little better in communicating refugee rights in this time when economic devils are unleashed to take the hindmost. We have failed to reach them because we largely don't take Hanson and her followers seriously. We treat refugee rights as just an ethical issue, without considering the material economic basis for people's fears and hostility. Too often, we just abuse opponents of refugees as racists. If you think of a lot of the chants at our rallies, this is what happens. Of course, their views are racist, but their underlying needs and concerns are not. I vividly remember on one of our demonstrations, marching up King Street, shouting, "Refugees are welcome here! Refugees are welcome here!" There was a young woman on the side of the road, clearly living it rough on the streets of Sydney. She yelled at us, "Refugees are not welcome here. What about me? What about me?" What about me? What about her indeed? Moralising and lecturing about compassion and morality is not going to reach this young woman, let alone abusing her as a racist. And it won't reach many others like her, struggling for a foothold and a secure place to maintain their lives. As the great communist writer Bertolt Brecht said, "Erst kommt das Essen, dann kommt die Moral." First comes food, then comes morality. Yet cruelty and xenophobia reflect only one aspect of Australia. The dark angels of fear and xenophobia are countered by our better ones, our light angels of fairness and humanity. We need to remind ourselves that while Hanson has won 4 Senate seats, the Greens, with their much more rational, humane policy on asylum seekers and refugees, have 9. Australia's record in multiculturalism is hardly perfect. However, we largely manage to balance social inclusion with fostering diversity. Comparatively around the world, we do quite a good job of integrating new arrivals when we put the resources into it which we know are needed. And we are told by social researchers that multiculturalism is one of the highest values for Australians. If we are to defeat the dark angels and their avatar, Pauline Hanson, we must appeal to the better nature of Australians, their sense of a fair go, of compassion and equality. We must not increase the demonisation by in turn demonising and ridiculing Hanson and her followers. This only feeds their sense of exclusion and victimhood. After all, Hanson was in the political wilderness for 20 years, so it's not about Hanson. In our group, People Just Like Us, one of the refugee advocacy groups which I work with, we focus on enabling people to meet asylum seekers and refugees. We believe in the power of human stories to reach people. When they hear the stories and experiences directly from refugees and asylum seekers personally, they can connect at the human level. The human connection awakens their better angels. Stories abound of how Australians have taken refugees into their hearts and communities when they have had an opportunity to meet them as human beings, people just like us, on the sports field or other social contexts. This allows the abstract nonsense of the anti-asylum seeker narrative to fall away. Countering the cruelty and indifference of the government and opposition, there is an enormous number of groups and individuals advocating and providing services for refugees and asylum seekers. There have been countless rallies and actions, but none of them have been big enough to place real pressure on the government to date. It is a real paradox that despite this enormous energy and generosity, the political impact over the last 20 years in terms of turning back policy has been zilch. In fact, despite some small victories, the situation is getting worse. Why is this? Firstly, the broad movement is incredibly fragmented. Every group and organisation is doing its own thing, paddling its own canoe regardless of the rest. The groups have failed to unite into a powerful force for change. Secondly, the concerns that fuel Hanson's party run deep in a significant section of Australians. The official narrative on asylum seekers still has many in its grip. When the 267 asylum seekers in Australia for medical treatment were threatened with being returned to Nauru, including babies born in Australia, the Let Them Stay movement arose in strong non-violent protest. So far, to our knowledge, none have been sent back to Nauru. However, in a poll held in February 2016, 39% believe they should be sent to Nauru and 25% didn't know. The remaining 40% believe they should be allowed to stay. In the same poll, 34% of those polled thought conditions for asylum seekers on Manus Nauru were good or very good. These views are the direct result of the deliberate veil of secrecy thrown around these gulags by the coalition government. Probably there is an element of wishful thinking and not wanting to know as well. So we have a real challenge ahead of us to turn the situation around. A successful strategy must be on two levels. It must reach the grassroots of the community, then it must mobilise the grassroots to work on the top political level to achieve change. Our group, people just like us, works at both these levels. With our refugee partners, we have the conversations whenever and wherever we can. With forums, stalls, creative happenings, home gatherings, we promote these face-to-face meetings. These can change hearts and minds and hopefully inspire action for change. And we support public demonstrations for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, working with other activists in the very varied movement. We act locally by promoting delegations to MPs in their local offices to let them know the views of a significant number of their constituents. When an MP feels the impact of the concerns of the voters, she or he will express that in the party rooms, translating that into political pressure for change. Phone calls and emails to MPs can have a similar effect, especially if in sufficient numbers. Unlike some, we do not see such local political pressure as futile or somehow leaving the power with the political class. These strategies are an important way of exercising people power upon the political class. They complement and amplify the force of the more public demonstrations, or manifestations, as the French say. And we see it as essential that the fragmented refugee advocacy movement be united to pressure government for change. To this end, in partnership with the Refugee Action Coalitions around the country, we have developed a pledge for a just policy for refugees. The aim of this policy is twofold. Firstly, it identifies a positive way forward. So often we hear all about what's bad. I've done quite a bit of that tonight. But we look to a positive way forward. So often we hear the cry of Tina. There is no alternative to this policy. Tina is a very good friend of the right wing. She is a frequent guest at their dinner parties. They constantly cite her to justify their nonsensical, cruel policies. But the pledge is a positive alternative to all the negative cruelty of the current policies. It identifies five policy points that no one can reasonably disagree with, and has obviously a lot in common with it was built around the existing policies of the broader movement, so that there's a core there that people we thought would be able to support. Those who sign it, organisations and individuals, pledge to work in their various ways which make sense to them to promote these 5 points as policy for Australia. So these are the 5 points as follows. First, immediate release and settlement for all those suffering at our hands. This means immediately closing offshore centres and bringing all persons seeking asylum and those assessed as refugees to Australia for permanent settlement. End mandatory detention. There should be no detention of asylum seekers. There should be open reception centres for health, identity and security checks. These must be genuinely independently monitored for conformity with human rights and the well-being of the residents. Number 3, raise the refugee intake substantially. Australia must substantially increase the number of people to whom we offer asylum. Only then will we have the moral authority to expect other developed nations such as the US and Japan to step up and do their share. Fourth point, safe passage of asylum seekers to Australia with no punishment based on the means of arrival. Working with the UNHCR, Australia needs to provide safe alternatives to people seeking asylum with fair and timely processing for their claims in countries of transit such as Indonesia and Malaysia. Those who are successful in their claims should be flown to Australia for resettlement. There should be no discrimination against people who arrive on our shores by boats seeking asylum. We should absolutely ban turning back boats. And the last one, give permanent settlement visas with full rights, including citizenship and work family reunion. Those applying for refugee status should have full legal rights and available to others such as tourists, including the right to work and legal review. Those accepted should have the same rights as other Australians, including eventual citizenship if desired. Whatever the outcome, there should be no refoulement or deportation to danger. So these are the 5 points. Who can object to these basic rights for those fleeing protection and safety? If we can rein in our Australian dark angels and release the light ones, this policy will seem to be what it is: common sense and decency. As well as offering a positive way forward, the pledge provides a program which the fragmented refugee advocacy movement should be able to unite and mobilise around. Because fragmentation of the movement is its greatest weakness at present and the source of our lack of success to date. The larger, well-resourced NGOs need to consider how much their close relations with government may be undermining their role of advocating effectively for refugees and asylum seekers. It makes it too easy to buy into the parts of the official narrative, if only in part. This can hobble a clear articulation of the policies needed to bring Australia back into international law and a humane, rational approach. We must not minimise and dismiss the huge task confronting the world. Globally, there are over 60 million displaced people. As a fawning ally of the US, Australia has leapt with great alacrity to support them in their imperialist wars. We cannot shrink from our share of responsibility in creating this tidal wave of humanity across the world. People are becoming more and more desperate. If we were facing a massive earthquake or tsunami, Australia would certainly help. So we must just step up and take many more refugees if we are to have any more moral authority in demanding that other nations do more. Very much like the climate change issue. If we do nothing, we don't have any moral authority. Currently, the most impoverished nations on earth are carrying a disproportionate share of the load. Yet without solid policies for their effective integration, significantly increasing our refugee intake risks increasing social resentment, division and disaffection. Within Australia, there are too many vulnerable people who are in no position to negotiate the current economic challenges. They have no way to meet Turnbull's demand that they be nimble. Increasing the refugee intake without addressing their legitimate concerns and needs will only feed alienation, hostility and racism. The so-called regional solution in our government's hands involves pressuring the poorest countries in our region to take on our responsibilities while paying them enormous sums to do it. A truly regional solution would be to help assess people in so-called transit countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia and fly recognised refugees safely. We can do this, we've done it before. In the 7.5 years Malcolm Fraser was PM, he accepted more than 50,000 Vietnamese people. Of these, only 2,000 arrived directly by boat. The West reprocessed in refugee camps in Southeast Asia. While there's been a lot of mythologising around Fraser's policies on refugees, in the end, under pressure from the US State Department, he got it right. As I've said, we in Australia have a mind to, when we have a mind to, we are very effective in settling and integrating immigrants and refugees. As Asher Hurst of the Refugee Council of Australia said, it is important to recognise that our taxpayer dollars are being used to systematically abuse and torment asylum seekers. Not only are we ethically compelled to find humane alternative, it also makes simple economic sense. We can do it and we must. Thank you.